It was raining on the night of November 2nd, 1968, when the doctor was awoken by the cries of his 14-month-old son. When he walked into his room, he was pointing at the shuttered window and to the flashes outside. The doctor only assumed it was lightning. Curiously, though, there was no sound of thunder. Little did the doctor know that what would happen next would become one of the most astounding cases in UFO history. Dr. X, as he's become known, has kept his identity a secret, primarily because he wanted to protect the privacy of his family, and he didn't want to tarnish his reputation as a man of science with the UFO encounter, with the stigma of the UFO encounter. Ami Michel, who did the initial investigation, legendary French investigator, gave him the pseudonym Dr. X and kept his identity private. Dr. X got a bottle for his son and settled him down to sleep. Next, suddenly he heard this loud banging against his house, and it was coming from the second floor. He went up to the second floor and noticed that some of the shutters had come loose and were banging against the house in the high winds that were going on that evening. So as he was securing the shutters, he noticed that he could see across the valley. There was these rhythmic flashes lighting up the entire valley that was across from his house. It was about a 3 to 4 kilometer stretch. And the weird thing is that the flashes would go off on a regular interval, every second or so. And there was no thunder. So this was very odd. But he could not see the source of the lightning or the flashes from that vantage point. He limped downstairs to get a glass of water and noticed on the clock that it was 3:55 a.m. The doctor had been injured while fighting in Africa, fighting in Algeria for France over 10 years ago, or over 10 years prior to this event. And he also slashed his leg open while chopping wood in an accident, and he had cut a vein and it had become infected. So he was in a lot of discomfort, a lot of pain, and limping around a lot because of not only the injury, but also the war injury that he had suffered. Dr. X went to the living room to see if he could get a better view of the craft. He opened his doors to his terrace, and what he saw there astounded him. He was absolutely shocked and transfixed by these two elliptical craft coming down the valley, slowly, parallel to one another. They had antennae horizontally. Each craft had antenna coming on each side at 180 degrees, and then an antenna on top. And as they were flying parallel to each other, they were shooting this flash of energy back and forth that was lighting up the entire valley. They were silvery white on top and sunset red on the bottom. As they drifted down the valley, the objects got closer and closer together. At one point, it looked like they were going to crash, except that they actually merged. And it became, to his astonishment, it became one large object. But as it got closer, he was just absolutely transfixed, and he was able to make out some of the details on the bottom of the craft. It looked like it was divided into 11 segments with horizontal dark lines traveling up. These horizontal dark lines sort of traveling up at random intervals. And then when he looked at it, it looked like it violated the laws of perspective, as though it were like some kind of M.C. Escher drawing, except real. The craft may have had some extra-dimensional properties. As the object got within 600 feet of Dr. X's home, he noticed it was coming closer to his house, and to him, it started to slowly orbit on the axis of the antenna that were coming out the sides, and the beam of light was also turning towards him, and it struck him in his house, and he instinctively put his hand in front of his face to protect his eyes. And then suddenly, as that happened, bang, there was a loud noise, and it was gone. All that was left was this wispy, white, fleecy, cloud-like material that seemed to blow away with the wind, as well as like this white cable or wire-like structure shot up straight into the sky. And when it became a tiny dot, it kind of exploded like a firecracker. And it was gone. The doctor, in complete shock, runs inside the house, into the kitchen, and grabs a notebook and starts sketching out everything that he saw and writing notes. When he does, he runs upstairs excitedly to talk to his wife and tell her what happened. Starts pacing around the room excitedly, telling her what he'd seen. And she looks at him and goes, "Your leg!" And he looks down and he's completely free of pain and discomfort. He looks at his wound and it's completely healed. There's only a slight trace of a scar left. Eventually, they get to sleep. About an hour later, she wakes up and hears him talking in his sleep. She turns on the light and starts taking notes because it seems pertinent to the events. He starts talking about the event. So she starts writing it down, and he says one peculiar thing. Contact will be reestablished on November 2nd by falling down the stairs. The next morning, she got up and she let him sleep in. By the time he got up, he didn't remember anything. He had no recollection of the event at all. When she confronted him with the notes and the drawings that he had made, he was shocked to see his handwriting, frankly. He had no idea. But, curiously, later that afternoon, as he was walking down the stairs, he tripped and fell and banged his head, and then suddenly everything came back. So it was as if he had made a prophecy in his sleep, and it had come true the next day. This is just one of the many strange things that happened in this case. Later, he said it was as if his leg was hooked and he'd been deliberately tripped. After his fall and his bump on his head, he had completely remembered everything. It was at this point that his wife had suggested that they call Emmy Michel, a personal friend and famous UFO researcher, to come and give his take on the events as a respected researcher. In the coming days, a triangular patch of skin had formed over a discolored triangular patch of skin had formed over his navel, and it had seemed as though, it was like caused by a light sunburn. He had significant abdominal pain during this time as well. His son had also developed a similar patch of discoloration over his navel as well. Dr. X had the patch examined by a dermatologist who had never seen anything like it. He was so shocked by it that he wanted to submit a report to the Academy of Medicine. Now, the Dr. X did not want any more attention and did his best to dissuade the dermatologist not to file this report. This patch, by the way, would be a reoccurring thing throughout the years after this event. Soon after, Dr. X had another accident, which caused him to have an open fracture, and he also experienced another spontaneous healing, much to his surprise. So he went into hiding for a few days because this caused him a significant amount of embarrassment. He didn't want to have to explain, which he had no explanation for, how his fracture had healed so quickly. Little did they know that this was the beginning of many outlandish experiences that were almost too fantastical to believe, were it not for the credibility of the witnesses, the medical evidence of the spontaneous healing, and the discolored patch of skin that would come and go throughout the years. In the weeks after seeing the UFO, Dr. X and his wife had experienced poltergeist-type activity, with items disappearing and reappearing at random locations throughout their home. Dr. X had also experienced levitation at random times, sometimes out of his bed, sometimes when he was just about his business, about his home, he would levitate up to the ceiling. At one point, he had a piece of flypaper in his hand, and when he levitated up 20 feet up to the ceiling, he tacked it to the top to show Emmy Michel at least some evidence of what was going on. They also experienced electrical anomalies and problems in their home. So they called 2 electricians to come out from the power company to come have a look at it. The electricians were completely baffled, and they called it witchcraft. Thankfully, though, the poltergeist activity did fade over time. Now, before the 1-year anniversary of the encounter, the doctor heard a voice tell him that something was going to happen on November 1st, 1969. So he decided to invite his friend Emmy Michel over, and when the date arrived and he came over, Emmy Michel asked him if he had a discoloration on his abdomen, and to which the doctor lifted up his shirt and there was none. Now, the doctor, being an accomplished pianist, was playing something nice for them to relax by. Suddenly he stopped, stood up and said, "It's beginning again." And then he lifted up his shirt and the discoloration was back. Soon after the 1st-year anniversary of the encounter, he was enjoying vacation with his family in southern France, when suddenly he heard a whistling in his ear. He was just out with his family, enjoying himself, and then he had this whistling in his ear and a compulsion to go back to the hotel. So he gets back to the hotel, and the hotel manager meets him and says, "You've got a call waiting for you." So he goes and he takes this call, and the man on the other end of the line forcefully and determinedly says, we're going to meet soon and discuss what you had seen. When he got back home sometime later, he heard the whistling again in his ear. He got into his car, and he felt compelled to get into his car, and he drove to a location near his home, like he was guided there. And he saw this man standing by the side of the road, this tall man with these striking blue eyes, standing next to a very expensive French car. At the time, he got out of his car when he got there and went to talk to this guy, and he was astounded when this guy started apologizing to him for all the weird things going on around his house since the sighting. Things got even weirder when the man that he met with started talking about paranormal things, and at this point the details are a little fuzzy, but things got weirder in Dr. X's life. I mean, he started to experience teleportation, missing time travel, and even an alternate landscape. One time he found himself driving down a road that shouldn't have existed, in a landscape that shouldn't have been there, like it was an alternate dimension or something. These types of phenomena have been reported in UFO cases, other UFO cases, and even including military reports that go back to the 1940s. The man never gave his name, so Dr. X called him Mr. Bede. And this Mr. Bede one time showed up at his house with a short humanoid about 3 feet tall, which looked like it had mummified skin. Disturbingly, it was mostly motionless, but its eyes would dart back and forth quickly as if scanning the room. Then, 3 years later in 1971, in an event that rivals the UFO encounter in strangeness, Dr. X was supposed to have lunch with his wife and some friends, and he just went out briefly to move the car, and then suddenly he felt an impulse to drive to a nearby town. When Dr. X got to the town, he noticed the mysterious Mr. Bede was there waiting for him, and he got out of his car and was thinking, what now? And Mr. Bede cryptically told him, we have to go somewhere. At which point, immediately, in a flash, it was as if he were teleported into another city. And he found himself lying on a bed in a room. And he knew he was in another city. And he got up and he looked and he saw that he was in Paris. And across the street was the Ministry of the Interior, a government building. Down the street, at that time, was driving Mr. Bede in his car. And he drove through a guarded gate, and the soldiers there saluted as he drove by. Dr. X was alarmed, to say the least. He saw a phone in the room from which he frantically telephoned his wife to tell her what happened. There was nothing he could do but wait. 20 minutes later, he saw Mr. Bede drive by again, at which point, it was as if he were teleported. He was back in his house, back home. These episodes caused significant stress for Dr. X and his wife, particularly for his wife, especially when he reported sensing alien presences around the house. She felt, stressed out, having to take care of the kid and having to worry about what was going to happen next. Thankfully, these episodes died down as time went on and life returned more or less to normal. What do you think? Did he make it all up? Seems unlikely. If it weren't for the medical records that show his sudden, miraculous, spontaneous healings, as well as the avoidance of publicity, also 2 prominent UFO researchers from France vouched for the veracity of the story by publishing it. Interestingly, similar experiences to what Dr. X had reported have also been documented in other UFO cases, including military reports of pilots coming back with experience of illusionary landscapes, disorientation, skin lesions after encounters with anomalous craft. For more on this case and others, I've put an affiliate link in the description to Jacques Vallée's book, Confrontations, A Scientist's Search for Alien Contact, which is one of the main sources for this story. I would also highly recommend Think Anomalous, a YouTube channel that does a really great job of researching stories of this type. And I also put a link in the description to Amy Michel's initial report on this case. If you like tales of intrigue, mystery, tales of strangeness, and sometimes terror, consider liking and subscribing. If you like this shirt, there's an affiliate link in the description below. See you next time. And if you see Mr. Bede, tell him it's a terrible waste of taxpayer money to play pranks on citizens.